Oh, I didn't realize it was recording. Okay, screen share. Come on. All right, I guess you guys are there. Okay, so this is the lecture for Thursday, November 18th. Today we did the job fair that you guys were at. So this is then kind of the second part of the participation. I'm gonna move myself here so that way, for some reason, I kind of looking at myself. Anyway, so I'm gonna try to keep this about 20 minutes. This would have been a lecture today had we had a full class, so it's not a big deal. And then I will tell you afterwards what you need to submit to me to complete the participation. And then what I advise is obviously you never have to take full complete notes because I'm going to upload everything. But what I ask in this case, based on what we're going to do at the very end, please just kind of take some notes on things that are of interest to you, and you know, maybe some gaps in knowledge that I've left unintentionally. So just kind of keep this in mind because I don't plan to do the assignment. So all right, so we're going to talk about the politics of public policy evaluation. Okay, well, I want to proceed this with, we're looking at the politics of public policy evaluation. So obviously public policy is any law that has been passed. Well, we've discussed it, it's so much more than that, but generally public policy is law that's been passed by Congress and signed, or a bill that's been passed by Congress and signed into law by the president, or regulations from within a department that have been implemented based on departmental guidelines, you know, that have obviously then previously been given, that power has been given to them by the Congress as through bill and signed into law by the president, yada, yada, yada. So it's, I mean, public policy is obviously just about anything that is in effect in law, that is just law regulation, that is just, you know, part of the governmental workings and things that affect us on some level in our daily lives. And so the thing that we have to keep in mind is obviously Republicans and Democrats in the United States agree on very little, or at least when it comes to fundamental issues, they disagree on many things. And so while one might see a law or an organization, department, in this case, I'm going to kind of more broadly speaking of departments, federal departments, on, you know, while one party might see a department functioning very well, if they were to evaluate from the outside or hire an evaluator to go in the department and really kind of break down, the other party might not. So for the sake of argument, I'm, you know, and boy, oh boy, am I painting with a broad random brush here, but the Republicans might look at the Department of Defense and say, hey, positive evaluation, while Democrats might look at it and go, nope, negative evaluation. Democrats might look at Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, any of those social net programs that go, hey, positive evaluation. Republicans go, no, negative evaluation. So, I mean, it really does come down to opinion, but what was the kind of common thread there between why Republicans and Democrats liking or disliking something and evaluating things negatively or positively? It's the politics. You know, if they didn't have an R or D next to the name, we might think that they, even if both opinions on either or any of those departments truly are objective, you know, if the Republican evaluator or a group of evaluators did look at things objectively and say, yes, this was good or this is bad, and you know, and then an equivalent Democrat evaluator or group of evaluators could look at the same department and say, yes, this is bad or this is good. Even if they really are looking at things objectively, at least attempting to, the party with whom they represent is obviously political. And so there will be bias there. So if we could take out the R and the D, maybe we could recognize these evaluations as being wholly objective. But because we see those party representations next to them, we can't see this wholly objective. It's impossible to see as wholly objective because we recognize where Republicans tend, and that's the word that you've heard. It's the word of the semester, is tendency. You know, it's where you know, one direction is where we tend to expect Republicans to lean, and where we tend to expect Democrats to lean. And then if you're a Republican, and let's just say, you know, you look at the Department of Defense, again, totally random option, and you say, you know, and you expect an evaluation, say, positive, and a Republican evaluator comes out and goes, negative. Well, now we're going, well, they're just a rhino, they're biased, they were bought off, they're part of the swamp, yada, yada, yada. They might be, I mean, they could be all of those, but they could be none of those, and they could have just been their objective opinion. But either way, what played into the reaction? The politics. So that's really what we're going to focus on. So a little background information is who evaluates a policy or a department or organization of the federal government. There are obviously anybody can. I mean, you right now can look at the Department of Defense, you can look at Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, anything, Department of Education, and just evaluate from an outsider's perspective and go, yeah, it ain't working, or it could be working better, or it's working great. Why don't touch it, that kind of thing. So kind of the primary groups, though, the elites within the nation, within the governmental agencies, think tanks, national, international audit organizations, institutions, regulators, those people who have direct access to all things within the Department of Policy, they're obviously potential evaluators. Interest groups, trade association, business groups, pressure groups, the media, they're also now they're kind of like that middle tier. They don't have quite the same level of unfettered access that some of those elite groups might, but they definitely have enough access and study up, I would suppose, on the policies of departments to be able to come to a very well-educated opinion and perspective, even if they are biased. And then citizens, again, you and I are evaluators of all things. I mean, just you having an opinion on something is an evaluation. And how do we do it? Through complaints, through whistleblowing opportunities, through public opinion via polls, and then through voting, of course. Something I talk about in my government politics class is that there's only one poll that really matters. And it's because there's only one poll that actually accurately gets where the nation is at any one moment on any one issue. And that is an election. All the polls in 2016 said Hillary, 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 Hillary. And if we have just gone off and said on November 8th, I believe the election day was that year, and just said, well, it's November 8th, all polls say Hillary wins, so we're making Hillary president, then we would have missed out on the only poll that actually mattered, and that was the actual election itself, which showed Donald Trump coming out on top. So, of course, some agencies and even some policy may in some ways be shielded from evaluations, and some also, but at the same time, some also might have repeated evaluations thrust upon them. And how this might happen, by those, I really do mean kind of like the higher end, the elite, or at least interest group evaluations. Although obviously citizens through voting and whistleblowing can either ignore or regularly evaluate an organization or policy. So, I mean, which ones might, the very, very public departments, organizations, and policies are going to be evaluated time and time again. The less than public are probably more likely to be evaluated less frequently, or more infrequently, if you will. So, I mean, that's how some can be evaluated with regularity and how some others can't. And then also, I mean, again, this is kind of the political side of things. We're going to angle this today. And so if Republicans have power, again, I'm being fully, generic here. If Republicans are in power, they might audit, say, Social Security, evaluate Social Security time and time again as they try to make adjustments to do whatever it is they want to do with it. Whereas if Democrat, and so thus they are, Social Security is then having to endure multiple kind of regular and consistent evaluations. Whereas if Democrats are in power, and by power, I mean obviously the Congress and the White House, they are less likely to mess with Social Security. And so now it becomes pretty shielded. And then, Republicans in the minority at that point might be saying, we need to be evaluating, we need to make changes, we need to tear it down, blah, 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 blah. But being that they are the more minority, it's not that their opinion is irrelevant, but it obviously holds far less weight because the majority is going to control votes, and hence why it might shield it. So why do programs, departments, policies need to be evaluated? The government needs to determine policy outcomes. Are the outcomes being met that were required? They need to identify policy strengths. Where is this policy? Where are these departments, organizations succeeding? As well as then where are they? What are the weaknesses? Do the weaknesses prove the policy is failing entirely? Do the weaknesses prove that there just needs to be some adjustments made to it? Do the weaknesses prove that things need to be just gotten rid of? So on and so forth. Then there needs to be a justification of resources, and that evaluation probably comes internally in most cases within the organization, not from the outside looking in, and that's because Congress funds all of our departments and organizations federally every year. And if an organization is unable to justify the funds that they have been receiving, then Congress is obviously going to pull from them. They're not going to spend the money on that. Why evaluate? Because of increased emphasis on accountability. Maybe some departments have kind of gone off the rails a little bit. And so this kind of allows for some accountability to be maintained because there's constant evaluations. When a department is not evaluated very often, nobody's looking into it, there's a lot greater chance for corruption, of course, because nobody's looking. But when people are constantly looking, then people are more likely to be less corrupt because there's a greater chance of them being caught for corruption. And a professional responsibility to show effectiveness. Obviously, everybody wants to be, and I suppose I shouldn't say everybody, but most of us want to, prove to others around us with a voice that we belong where we belong or where we are. And so, evaluations then internally, again, will kind of show Congress, a justification of resources, but then also it shows an effectiveness and professional responsibility, which kind of goes hand in hand. Okay, so there are 4 types of evaluation we're going to dive into real quick. Process evaluation, outcome, income, and cost benefit. So a process evaluation is used to determine why a program or policy is performing at the if I can only speak, it'd be a better public speaker. But why they're performing at current levels. Now, this can be both positive and negative. I think if you read that sentence, you're kind of expecting negativity. And then my next bullet is, it's then to identify any problems. Why is it performing at this level? Because the assumption is that it's not performing as high as expected. Then the evaluation is, okay, here are the problems. This is why it's not, it's performing here. We want it to perform here. Now let's develop solutions that will allow it to at least incrementally reach up to this point. And then thus that improves those, based on those developed solutions, it would improve the program performance by recommending how solutions should be implemented and evaluated then once carried out. So of course, you can't just say, here's a solution, and then bye, shut the door and never go back again. How do you know that that solution was in and of itself effective? So then it's got to be, okay, here's the solution. Now let's check up every week, every month, every 3 months, 6 months, yearly, every 5 years, whatever it takes, depending on the rolling out of the solution. And now let's reevaluate and make sure that we are reaching the level we want to reach. So that's process evaluation. Outcome evaluation is it following its legislative intent. So obviously very often, and I know we discussed this in actually at least one lecture, maybe 2 lectures in the past. Sometimes, depending on the size of the department, especially if a department, say, takes Social Security, where there are thousands of offices throughout the country, because you need to have a Social Security department basically in every major, you have to have probably multiple in every major city. And then you've got to have departments in rural areas that people can have access to. So often with those very large federal departments that have many, many, many branches, middle management can kind of go on their own. They can kind of, in some capacity, they can kind of interpret the law in ways, or interpret their responsibilities, or interpret outcomes in ways that the Congress did not intend. Thus, the outcome evaluation is guaranteeing that that department and the policy as a whole are following that legislative initial intent. And remember, I mean, congressional bill that has been signed by the president is thus law. And so if you're not doing what the law is intending, you're breaking the law. It doesn't always mean, though, that a middle management, who's not doing what the intent was, is going to get arrested and fined and in prison. Probably not. At worst, they probably get fired. But in essence, they have broken the law, and therefore Congress is going to want to know, okay, why, and how do we fix it? So outcome evaluation also requires or asks the question of, is it meeting program goals? So not only is it meeting following legislative intent, but then this is also meeting the program goals. What are the program elements, indicators that are going to give us the data and information that we need through the evaluation? What are the measures of indicators? And I have to be very vague here because it's obviously different from department to department. Measurement indicators for the Department of Defense are going to be completely different from Social Security. So, it's impossible for me to just make a generic statement other than kind of these baselines. But I mean, just kind of in your mind, very briefly, think of any random department of the federal government and kind of just think, okay, what might a measurement indicator be for an evaluation? And I'm sure you'll just think of, something off the top of your head and go, okay, well, you recognize. And of course, what are the program outcomes, hence outcome evaluation? Are they positive? Are they negative? Is the program functioning in a positive way? Is functioning in a negative way? So on and so forth. Number 3 is impact evaluation. And this asks the theoretical or looks for the theoretical goals of the program and policy and compares them to the actual goals. So just a random thing. I mean, the theoretical goal is it's going to help 1 million people. What is the actual goal? It's helping 750,000 people. It's helping 100,000 people. It's helping 15, to 1 million people. Where is it? Again, it's also going to evaluate the program and policy objectives to make sure that it's making the impact that it was intended by the Congress when the bill was passed, when the department was created, when the bill was signed into law by the president, when the department was created. And then also the program or policy results and whether they are intended or unintended positive or negative effect. What do I mean by that? Or what did I mean by that? I'm trying to rethink as I wrote this. Whether program or policy results and whether, I'm assuming, what are their intended or unintended positive and negative effects? What I mean by this is just, what are the unintended, what are both the intended and the unintended consequences, both positives and negatives? That's what I'm trying to say. I really need to go back and reread this. So what were the intended consequences, the intended outcomes? What were the unintended consequences of this? Maybe creating a department pulls people from, who had been getting help from over here, moving them over here, and now it's hurting another department, something to the effect, or organization. So what were the intended and unintended outcomes and effects and consequences? And what are the positives and the negatives, so on and so forth. I hope that makes sense. I apologize. Oh, I forgot I forgot to fix this. Holy cow, that's a lot of notes. And then the cost benefit evaluation. So cost benefit analysis is obviously the comparison of the costs associated with the policy and program outcomes. So are the outcomes that are being achieved worth the cost that are going into it? That is essentially all it is. So, I mean, cost benefit is a really, really big deal. And I know we talked about that last week, but in essence, it's strictly just, are the outcomes being achieved worth the cost? Because if let's say, throw a random number, let's just use our education, for example. Let's say that, we know, the university knows each one of you guys are going to graduate. Okay. But it costs the school $50,000. It costs the school $50,000 to provide the education that you're receiving to graduate. They might look at that and go, that's just way too high. We can't afford an average of $50,000 per student, especially if maybe your tuition's only $40,000. Now the school's in the red by $10,000. So thus, the benefit of your graduation and education is not worth the cost. So then, you make a cost benefit evaluation and you look at, and say the school in this case would say, okay, where can we cut costs that'll still allow students to get the same education and graduate while also not costing the university as much? Now, let's say they're able to cut $30,000 and now it costs the university $20,000. You're still paying $40,000 in tuition, but now it means the university is making $20,000 on teaching you that education, or teaching you and giving that education. So that would then, and again, I've got a million notes here I need to go back, but in essence, that is then what a cost benefit evaluation would be. It's just, is this program worth the money? Often, unfortunately, because the program itself was designed to help people on some level, if a cost benefit analysis, which by the way, remember today's kind of theme is the political side, which by the way, can still be construed as being very political. For somebody in Congress, so let's just say a Democrat, they might say, hey, yeah, that $50,000 it costs to educate, so on, X students, it's worth it. Whereas a Republican go, no, it ain't. We need to cut some costs. We're losing $10,000 per student. So again, that can still be very political. But often what will happen with Congress is when they do recognize, okay, it's just way too expensive to provide this service, to reach these ends, that benefit. rather than say shuttering the department, just going, it just doesn't work because they're providing a service that people might come to rely upon. And we're going to get to that here in a few moments. What they'll do is they'll just start throwing more money at it, and rather than saying, okay, we're going to just cut it, we're going to cut our losses, it doesn't work. People go back to the free market and find your, get the assistance or whatever it is that you're getting from this particular federal department. They're going to say, okay, never mind. We just need to allocate more money. We need to just make it worth it. So then it just kind of balloons the program even more because they just throw more people at it, more money in it, blah, 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 blah. So then you really start to get into kind of like heavy bureaucracy. Oh, I did. Okay, so I did cut it down. Oops. All right, so then so that I just need to either hide or delete. So cost benefit evaluation is a method with which to evaluate this and assess the effectiveness of policies, cost benefits outcomes for certain types of programs such as education environment. One could argue that the real benefits do not materialize for years, decades. There you go. There you go. And so, I mean, again, like I just said, and so, but to that example, that's right. Obviously, the money put into your education, let's take a college education, for instance, if it is costing, say, $50,000 to get you through school, the benefit, though, of your graduating could be worth millions, depending on the job that you go into and so forth. And so it still could take years. The environment, too, it's like, okay, we've got a pollution problem. We need to throw more money at it. So we throw a lot of money at that problem. And then, it creates technology, it hires people, it educates people to not pollute, so on and so forth. It could still take many, many years before we actually clean up that area of the environment. And so thus, in that sense, the outcome, the benefit is intrinsic, it's not financial. So the federal government throwing money at, say, an environmental issue, and even, to your education as well, for the sake of argument, they were paying for it. Then the outcome and the benefits to the cost is intrinsic. We're creating new workers, we're creating new taxpayers, we're creating new thinkers, or educating new thinkers, that kind of thing. And they, in turn, are going to make millions of dollars over the course of their lives. They're going to be entrepreneurs. They're going to invest in the next great thing. They're going to, whether they do or don't, they're then going to pay taxes the rest of their lives. So it's going to give income to the federal government, so on and so forth. And thus, the benefit of the cost of $50,000 per student is worth that kind of in the red spending because of that intrinsic value of your education, or as I said with the environment, the intrinsic value of a clean environment. All right, so I'm going to skip that. Okay, so I need some more coffee. Am I talking fast enough or am I talking slow? I feel like we're talking a little bit faster. Here, let me caffeinate. Cold brew with a shot of espresso, baby. Let's go. So what is the scope of an evaluation? So why is the first question then to ask in regards to scope is, why is the program being evaluated? Is it a mandatory evaluation? Does the federal government require that this program, department, what have you, is being, it becomes, what's the word? Or is evaluated, I guess, every year, every 5 years, that kind of thing. Are there policy outcomes that are required and that need to be reported on, and probably, need to be reported politically, to say, hey, yeah, look at this, these trillions of dollars we spent. I mean, look at the this new infrastructure bill. I guarantee you're going to hear updates on that thing for several years to show the American public, yes, it was worth the trillions of dollars of spending, because look at all these new bridges. Did Joe Biden give an example the other day in regards to that spending bill about how, like, what if you're on a crumbling bridge and on the other side the forest is on fire, you're going to die? Something like, look it up. I'm paraphrasing, but I remember hearing that. I was like, what? First off, how many bridges are crumbling in the United States? I'm sure there are plenty that are in some level of disrepair, but okay, the federal government wants to throw money in, fine. But then how many times are going to be on a crumbling bridge and on the opposite side is going to be a flaming forest? I mean, I'm not exactly sure. So what are the policy outcomes? Again, the evaluation will then be a means of kind of showing the American public, see all this money we've spent, it was worth it. And then are there required policy improvements? The outcomes could very well be obvious, where it's not just, in the evaluation isn't to discover any required policy improvements. Those policy improvements could just be as obvious as the, night is dark or the day is light or whatever. And part of that could just be like, think about, again, this new infrastructure bill. Let's say that the federal government puts up a sign at some crumbling bridge in the middle of New York, and they say, your tax dollars hard at work. You see that sometimes. Your tax dollars hard at work. This bridge will be repaired, fully functional by the spring of 2022. And then come summer of 22, it's still not done and nobody's worked on it. Fall 2022, it's not done, nobody's worked on it. In spring 2023, and well, then obviously, and the sign always says, it'll be finished by spring of 2022. Then instances like that is an obvious case of a policy needing improvement. Something needs to get done. Maybe the money didn't get to where it needed to go. Maybe the people that are hired, the contractors, just suck or too busy, whatever. And so that case, the departments or even the media is just covering, and it's just making it so obvious that no, this thing needs to be fixed. And the Congress goes in, they hire a set of evaluators and they go in and evaluate and they go, okay, what's the problem? No, let's either, however they need to mandate it, whether it's just, through a basic mandate, executive mandate, or if it's through a law, something like that. Excuse me, in terms of the scope, what is the scope? How large will the effort be? Is it going to be for something as large as, say, Social Security? They might not ever evaluate the whole thing all at once. They might just look at parts of it and then kind of rotate every year and go, okay, this year we're going to evaluate this part of Social Security, and next year we're going to evaluate this part of Social Security, and the following year we're going to evaluate the third part, and then maybe 4 years down the line they'll repeat. So then every 4 years, I guess it's technically every 3 years, the way I just gave that example, each area is being evaluated. So then again, they can also do a large, and then just go full on. Okay, we're going to just evaluate Social Security from top to bottom in 2022. And then broad, narrow. I mean, like broadly, are they just kind of looking for anything? Is it kind of, if you're thinking of a comb, is it just kind of wide, or it's just like, hey, we're going to just pass through, and if we happen to catch something, then we'll recommend some things. Or are they going to the fine tooth comb and they're like, hey, we're going to dive into everything. We're going to look at your pay stubs, for your janitors. Well, why? Well, because we're going to literally look at everything. So that kind of thing. And then in terms of the scope, in terms of the evaluation size, whether it's, the broad and large or small and narrow, can that evaluation realistically be accomplished? Is it going to be worth the attempt? The evaluation is going to cost money. Is it going to be worth the money? So on and so forth. So some of the evaluation challenges. Some of the challenges can be, is there more than one organization involved? And if so, are there common standards for measuring and recording benefits and costs? That can obviously be a big issue, especially if, I'll just keep using Social Security as an example. I mean, there's just thousands of branches across the country. Does every single branch have the exact same organizational standards and measurements? I would assume so. I mean, I would presume, because it's a federal agency, and why would things be different in Prescott than they are in Phoenix? But there could be regulatory agencies that have, well, this agency or this part of the regulatory agency regulates coal burning plants, and this one regulates nuclear plants, and this area, regulates wind, and this one water, and so forth. And so if you're going to, let's just say that's the EPA. If you're going to evaluate the EPA, and it's like, well, but the measurement standards are not the same for coal fire versus nuclear versus wind versus water, so on and so forth, then it obviously is going to make a full on environmental evaluation more difficult. There could also be a lack of documentation, not only just a lack within the organizations, but not only just a lack, but also intentionally hiding documentation, intentionally losing, that kind of thing. Sometimes management knows they screwed up the entire time, and now they're being evaluated. The best way to cover the tracks is just to burn the road behind them. So inadequacy of baseline measures, measuring success can only be made accurately by comparing or by comparting the level of performance before implementation sensitivities. Examining this is, unfortunately, what I'm about to say sounds stupid, but it's totally real. Examining performance within the department may lead to feelings of insecurity or grievance for those involved. You really do want to kind of think, well, suck it up, Buttercup, but at the same time, just saying. Then there's also the organization could be too busy. That should be busy and a bust, and it never gets the evaluation complete. As in the evaluation group could be too busy. Maybe they're evaluating too large, broad of an organization, or they're evaluating multiple organizations, they never get a chance to finish it. There can also be a lack of cooperation by involved agencies, and that definitely happens. You kind of, if you watch the news regularly, you can hear about that a lot. That an agency is not cooperating with Congress, and it's just like, well, wait a second, they control you, they created you, but they're not cooperating. And then also, guess what this one is? Politics. Again, we're talking about the political side. So public I'm so caffeinated right now. I love it. Public programs are performed in a political context, as I've said. So there will always be a sharp difference between the interpretation that an analyst might make about the success or failure of a program and the conclusion political officials might draw from the same data. Why? Because the political officials are elected. Again, maybe it's a Republican that's the official, or maybe it's a Democrat and the analyst is of opposing party, or even if the analyst just looked at it as objectively as they possibly could because they recognize that's my job, and they come up with results that their overseeing elected officials just disagree with and go, well, no, we're willing to accept this. The analyst might say, hey, wow, this really sucks. We're spending way too much money. But the overseeing body of Congress, the party just goes, no, we're willing to accept this. We print the money, we can raise taxes, yada, yada, yada. We're fine. Let's keep going. That's obviously very political. Evaluations may not be done for the purpose of evaluating a program, but to validate a decision that has already been made for very different reasons, being political reasons. We are doing it for political purposes. So we need you to evaluate to just show us, yeah, we're doing it for that reason, and it's working. And we can go and tell our constituents, yes, Social Security, I'm glad we raised taxes or, whatever. Thus, evaluations are often performed on very short notice, and evaluators may be given a little time to do their work because the outcomes are almost irrelevant. The purpose then may simply be to produce some sort of a justification about the public consumption, not to produce a genuine answer about the quality of the program. That is, in part, why institutionalization and partial forms of evaluation, such as the GAO, which we discussed last week, are so important in the public sector, is because while Congress can just completely ignore the cost of something and just do something strictly because it is in their political corner. That's not the word I'm looking for, but because it suits them politically. And the presumption is obviously it means that they're keeping their base happy and they're earning votes, buying votes, that kind of thing. The GAO should be looking at things as impartially as possible and simply really just breaking down the cost of programs. And that information is, once it's shared with Congress, it is released to the public for public consumption. So we can go back and look and go, well, wait a second, the Congress still passes, but the GAO said this is going to be an abject financial failure. It might be time to vote out our congressman, whatever. So their stability and relative impartiality in organizations such as the GAO offer some guarantee of the quality of the assessment made. We obviously can still expect there to be some sort of partisan, I recognize that it's like reflecting, going dark stuff. We obviously have to recognize the people who are still doing the evaluating, even if it is a nonpartisan organization like the GAO, there are still biased, opinionated, partisan people running those evaluations. But we can at least assume on some degree it's fairness and objectivity. All right, so ensuring effective and efficient monitoring. So there's one most important question that must go into any evaluation, and that is, what is it that needs to be known about the policy? You cannot, or an organization cannot evaluate, an analyst cannot evaluate unless they know exactly what it is they're looking for. If you were to just, somebody would say, hey, Adam Maines, we need to evaluate your work. Okay, what do you want to evaluate? Or let's just say, excuse me, I apologize. What I meant to say was, let's say they came to you. Let's say the university came to you and said, we want to evaluate Professor Maines as Adam Maines as professor. Go. What are you going to evaluate? You're going to evaluate my prep. You're going to evaluate my organization. Are you going to evaluate my grading? Are you going to evaluate my lecturing? Are you going to evaluate the assignments that I give? Are you going to evaluate my attentiveness and my working with the students? Like, what exactly are you going to evaluate? So what happens is that when the university does evaluate the professors, obviously the students are the one doing the evaluating, although you guys do get EOCs. I mean, you do get to evaluate us from one perspective, and that's from your perspective. But when the university does evaluate us, and we do get evals, I think once a year or so, then the analyst, which tends to be another professor or a dean or assistant dean, they have a document, a form that they fill out that is pre-written that says, here are what you're looking for when you evaluate this professor. And that, in essence, then is the overall question of what needs to be evaluated about myself as a professor and any professor, at this university. But then also, of course, from a policy perspective, what do the analysts need to evaluate? It might not be outcomes that need to be evaluated. The outcomes could be irrelevant. It could be the process. It might not be the cost. The cost could be evaluated. The cost could be irrelevant. It could be the outcomes. So it could be all of the above. It could be none of the above. It could be something completely different. It could just be, I don't know, how quickly is a claim being met? And again, the cost and the outcome could be irrelevant. It could just be, is a person having to wait a week? Are they having to wait a month to have a claim, heard and resolved, that kind of thing. So once that has been defined and that question has been defined, that is, then the evaluation process becomes fully measurable. Okay, so monitoring for control. I didn't mean to take that long of a pause there for dramatic effect, but I did need to take a breath. So what is the purpose of monitoring? So what should be measured, the purpose is what should be measured to ensure that the policy, one of three things, is producing the required results, is being carried out to schedule, to plan, and in accordance with its resources and cost plans, and that it remains viable in the face of secondary legislation. All I mean by secondary legislation is just additional legislation down the line that could have intended consequences for this original policy, but also could have unintended consequences. I mean, it could be, let's say that we had a Department of Nuclear Energy, and we do have a regulatory system. Let's just use our imaginations here and just say that there is a Department of Nuclear Energy that is akin to the Department of Energy itself, that is akin to Department of State. There's a secretary, that's part of the president's cabinet. Well, secondary, and it's functioning, Department of Nuclear Energy is functioning as it is, it's being, and nuclear energy is regulated correctly and yada yada. Well, then let's say secondary legislation comes down the line years later, decades later, that places the Department of Energy now places the Department of Nuclear Energy fully under the purview of the Department of Energy. And all of a sudden, the president loses that cabinet member because that the Department of Nuclear Energy, nuclear power, is now reporting to the Secretary of Energy, who is the cabinet member of the president. Hopefully that makes sense. If I had a whiteboard, I would have drawn that. Well, that secondary legislation, which is obviously now moving the Department of Nuclear Power, Nuclear Energy into the Department of Energy, could affect how the Department of Nuclear Power, or how nuclear power is regulated in the United States. So monitoring and evaluating, consistently with some regularity, and then certainly evaluating after the Department of Nuclear Power, Nuclear Energy has been moved into the Department of Energy, is very important to make sure that nuclear power is still effectively working in the United States, it's still being regulated correctly, so on and so forth. So that secondary legislation that just moves it over. And by the way, I mean, let's just now focus on the Department of Energy. There could be secondary legislation over here that now just says, okay, now the Department of Energy can no longer regulate coal. I don't know why, but just to say, and but does that hurt their regulatory purposes in other avenues? Wind and water and solar and nuclear and so on and so forth. So all of that, there's a million different pieces of legislation that could on some level affect any one department. So monitoring activities facilitate the checking and reporting on progress against the plan and its intentions and outcomes, and control activities promote revisions to be made to the plan in response to issues discovered during monitoring, so that way it can be moved and continue on in an efficient manner. And finally, I believe this is 3 slides. This is the last, 4, including this one. This is the last little bit. So finally is policy change. So after evaluation, 3 outcomes are possible. Policy maintenance, in which case a great deal of policy making is the result of attempts at policy change rather than of new issues coming to the public sector for the first round of resolution. So I mean, it means, that a great deal of legislation is intended to just kind of maintain, but verify organizations versus create something new. Policy termination. Most policy areas are already populated by a large number of programs in politics, as well as clients, citizens who are using those departments. So what is usually required is change rather than the creation of totally new policies. So in other words, if something is not functioning right now, let's just say it's Social Security, rather than terminating Social Security, what Congress will do is they'll say, okay, we're not going to go that far. We're going to go back to the maintenance. I don't know if you can see my mouse. We're going to go back to the maintenance side. We're going to just come up with legislation that fixes Social Security rather than terminate it, because there's so many people. Termination would then be a kind of almost a last resort. But then there's policy succession. So the policy succession, with the replacement of one policy by another, is therefore an important concept to examine if the development of I think that's what I mean by in the development of contemporary public policy. So that would obviously only occur if the original policy is fully terminated. So an example of how example of all of this would have been the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Republicans tried to, quote, repeal and replace Obamacare multiple times. Failed. So what they've ended up doing is just kind of giving maintenance to it. They've adjusted Obamacare in certain ways to try to help it and fix it, have it cost less money, have it be less intrusive on people. Results of that are varied. What they tried to do, though, with repeal and replace was the termination succession side. Often, however, Republicans didn't have a plan for replacement. Their repeal, so they were willing to terminate, which would have been repeal the law, which would have ended the law. But they didn't necessarily have a plan to replace it or succession. What their plan was let's go back to the way we were, because that was better than what we have under Obamacare. And then we'll take time coming up with a suitable replacement. Maybe had there been some great plan for replacement, they could have got repeal. They could have got the repeal side. They could have got the termination side. But instead, because they couldn't, what they've been forced to do over time is the maintenance aspect of it. So anyway, that's just an example. So policy maintenance, this rarely happens as a conscious choice, but rather a failure to make other decisions and just things kind of, going out of control. It is even possible for a policy to be considered seriously and then maintain the exact same form. So, I mean, again, I look at Obamacare, it was certainly considered seriously, the whole termination side of it, but it's just not happened. And at this point, might never happen, although it's still certainly possible. Part of this is because politicians make names for themselves with new legislation, not by advocating the maintenance of existing programs. So they just kind of say, okay, well, this thing is functioning. It might not work great, but if I can get something else to start up over here, then it'll look good and I can win re-election. Very few policies, as I said, are ever terminated, because maintenance is a little bit easier, I should say a lot of it easier to pull off if something is not functioning correctly. So once a policy is begun, it tends to have a life of its own. The policy, obviously, in the event of, like, say, a new department, develop organizations. These organizations hire personnel, and then the organization, via the personnel, provide a clientele, which are citizens who come to depend on the program for their provided services. So unfortunately, once clients, again, citizens, use the service, they may become dependent, and it becomes almost impossible for them to leave. And in particular, this is true, especially true for programs that create a stock benefit as opposed to those who merely have a flow of resources. So a stock benefit in this case would be, say, Social Security. You are already paying into Social Security. If you've earned a check, you paid into Social Security. Your Social Security, you have got a certain amount of funds that are attached to your Social Security number as we speak. And when you reach Social Security retirement age of 65, you can begin collecting those benefits. Well, if they were to just cancel Social Security, then for everybody who's ever put a penny into it, that money is now gone. And it's especially hurtful for those people who are, say, 60, who have paid hundreds of thousands of dollars of their earnings into Social Security over the decades, potentially up to over 4 decades, who now will just lose it. So terminating Social Security with this stock, it just kind of built up service, would be extraordinarily detrimental to the general public, because every one of us pay into it, because someday every one of us are supposed to have access to it. That said, it could hypothetically be a little bit easier to end something that is merely a flow of resources that isn't stocked up. It's just like, so under Biden's first stimulus law, they added a $250 a month check for all parents with children. And it was it's a 6-month thing. It was from June or July to December of this year. That would be a little bit easier to end. It will be easy because it's just kind of $250 for 6 months. So I mean, those kind of policies that are just kind of like monthly checks that have a termination date, that would be an end date built in, and you're not paying into it to build up and create this nest egg. It's just, hey, $250 every month for 6 months. That's a lot easier to end, and the law will end in December, unless they extend it, which I pray to God they don't. But and I'm an unfortunate recipient of it too, and I hope it ends. If you don't know why, you need to take an economics class, you guys. Oh, they can ask me. But anyway, so those kinds of things that are just kind of a flow of resources are easier. And although people, I guarantee you, whereas I'm saying I can live without $250, the United States needs to live without parents receiving $250 per kid, or $500, whatever it is. I don't even remember. I don't look. There are people that are kind of right now going, "Ooh, it's an extra $250 every month, and I don't have to work, and they just gave it to me." So even that is creating dependence, unfortunately, which is another problem. It's a psychological. There's an economic issue, which is probably more important than a psychological issue as to why programs like that need to go bye-bye. And then finally, policy succession. So policy succession can then take several forms. Linear succession involves the direct replacement of one program to another. So again, if you think of repeal and replace, if the Republicans had come up with a viable replacement plan, and they had repealed Obamacare and replaced it with that new one, that would have been a linear succession. Would have been just perfect. We're going from one thing to another. Consolidation. Some successions involve placing several programs that have existed independently into a single program. That should create a little bit more, it should make things a little bit more efficient in how those services are provided to people. Splitting. Some programs are split into 2 or more components in a succession. That could mean because the original program is just too bloated, and maybe the services that they're offering are conflicting with one another to some degree, and so pulling them apart and letting them run independently actually will allow for greater efficiency in presenting of the services. And then there's nonlinear. So this was a little more confusing, but some policy and organizational successions are complex and involve elements of other kinds of succession involving combining multiple programs, the multiple changes involved in creating, say, the Department of Energy from existing programs, including, okay, it's an example. It just means that it's a little of each. That's just a terrible example, I'm sorry, but it means a little of each. That some things are broken up, some things are moved together, something is then added in. It just becomes kind of more of a complex system, which does happen. I mean, I suppose maybe in a way that's how we could have recognized a repeal and replace of Obamacare could have been, or at least almost was attempted to be, based on the fact that there was no there was no just direct, this is what we're going to do to replace Obamacare. We're instead of replace and come up with something later, it was, had they just gotten the repeal out of the way, then it would have been more of a mishmash. That would have been more of a non-linear policy change. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So on that note, here's all you have to do. All I want you to do is ask yourself 3 questions based on this brief lecture that you would like to know a little bit more about in regards to, what was the title? It was the political side of the politics of public policy evaluation. Ask yourself 3 questions and just look up the answer as best you can. So literally, whatever your questions are, so just 3 questions based on this lecture and look up the answer as best you can. You obviously can't use my PowerPoint because I've explained everything as best I can, but use the textbook, use other resources that are on Halo as we speak, Google search, I don't care. And your responses are literally as long or as short as required for you to answer. So if they are, now you got to give me complete sentences. Don't say, should the federal government evaluate the Department of Energy? No, that doesn't count. And also you need to look at non-specifics. So I want you to ask questions kind of about the theoretical side of politics, the politics of public policy evaluation. So that's it. 3 questions. If your if your answer to those questions is 2 sentences, say 15, 20 words, perfect. If you need to write a paragraph, it's just, don't think of this as, I need to reach some sort of standard. It is just, I want you to dig a little bit deeper into this. Ask yourself 3 questions about all this, maybe kind of scan through the lecture and just kind of look at them, pieces and just say, what's a little bit more about this I can learn? Ask yourself a question and answer it. And then all I ask is that you just cite it. Where did you get the information? That's all. And that's it. And then just email it to me. Please just get that done. I'll give it to you. Please get it done by Saturday. So today is Thursday. Get it done by, I take that back. Have it done by Friday. Have it done by tomorrow, which is Friday. So if you're watching this on Friday, whatever, just have it done, and that's it. Just email the response. That'll complete your participation. Otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, I love you all. Have a great Thanksgiving. I wish I'd been able to say that to you guys in person. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, facial twitches of any kind, please go ahead and shoot me a text, 623-297-9637. You should have my number already. I will probably answer if you have questions on like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I'll probably answer texts. Don't be offended if I don't, just because I'm gonna just work my butt off to be completely and utterly caught up by Sunday night. So that way when I wake up on Monday, I literally have a full week of kind of rest. But that said, if you have anything pressing that you need to ask me Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'll totally answer. Thursday, I obviously won't answer. Friday, I might not, and then Saturday I won't because I'm at a wedding. And then Sunday, I might be able to. So if you ask me anything from Thursday on, I might not get back to you until Sunday at the earliest. Anyway, I love y'all. Have a great weekend. Have a great week. Have a happy Thanksgiving. Peace.